Hello everyone. Today I want to tell you the story of an extraordinary Kurdish woman who lived more than 200 years ago. She was a poet, a scholar, a religious thinker, and a historian. Her name was Masturah Ardalan. What makes Masturah so remarkable is not only what she achieved, but the time in which she achieved it. She lived in the 19th century, when political and intellectual life was largely dominated by men. Very few women had the opportunity to receive a serious education, become recognized writers, take part in intellectual discussions, or write history. Yet, Masturah managed to do all of these things together. She was born in 1805 in Sine, today known as Sanandaj, in Iranian Kurdistan. At that time, Sine was the center of the Ardalan Emirate, one of the important Kurdish principalities of the region. It was a place where political power, tribal traditions, religion, literature, and scholarship came. Masturah grew up in a respected and educated family, and from an early age she had access to something that was unusual for most women of her generation: education. She studied many subjects, including literature, religion, philosophy, language, logic, and mathematics. Some accounts even say that she studied 12 different fields of knowledge. Whatever the exact number is, it is clear that Masturah received an exceptional education for a woman of her time. But education was not simply something she possessed. She used it. She became deeply interested in poetry, history, religion, philosophy, and the larger questions of human life. She thought about love and loss, faith and destiny, power and morality, and relationship between people and their homeland. Language became one of the most important tools. Masturah wrote in Persian and Kurdish, and sources also associate some of her work with Kurmanji and Arabic. This multilingual background gave her writing a special character. For Masturah, poetry was not simply about creating beautiful sentences. It was a way of understanding life and expressing the things that were most important to her. Later, Masturah married Khosrow Khan Ardalan, the ruler of the Ardalan Emirate. This marriage placed her at the center of an important political and cultural environment. Khosrow Khan's court attracted poets, scholars, religious thinkers, and intellectuals. They gathered to discuss literature, philosophy, religion, history, logic, and other subjects. But Masturah was not simply the ruler's wife, sitting quietly in the background. She participated in these intellectual gatherings. She discussed ideas with poets and scholars, and according to accounts about her, she earned an important position among them because of her intelligence, education, and strong personality. What this meant in the early 19th century. Masturah was entering intellectual discussions that were largely dominated by men. And she was earning respect because she had knowledge and ideas of her own. She did not simply tell people that women were capable of intellectual achievement. She demonstrated it through her life. And one of the strongest expressions of her intellectual and emotional life was poetry. Some sources say that Masturah may have written more than 20,000 lines of poetry, although much of her work has unfortunately been lost. She wrote about love, faith, separation, suffering, homeland, memory, and time. Her husband, Khosrow Khan, was an important presence in her emotional poetry. She wrote about her love for him. And later she wrote about grief and separation. But her poetry was not limited to personal love. She used personal experience to think about larger questions of life: the passing of time, the pain of loss, and the fact that human happiness and political power do not last forever. Another important subject in her poetry was her homeland, especially Sine. For Masturah, Sine was much more than the city where she was born. It represented childhood, memory, family, identity, and belonging. Later, when she was separated from Sine, this connection became even more powerful. Nature also became part of this emotional world. Mountains, wind, water, night, and dawn could carry deeper meanings. A mountain could represent strength, the wind could carry memories, night could suggest loneliness, while dawn could suggest hope. Another interesting part of Masturah's literary life was her connection with Nali, one of the greatest names of Kurdish poetry. And for a woman of her time, that was significant. But Masturah was much more than a poet. Religion and spirituality were also important parts of her intellectual life. One of the works attributed to her is the Islamic Creed and the Treatise on Worship, written in Persian. She also wrote about Islamic law and religious matters. Her writings show her interest in worship, sincerity, morality, intention, and the relationship between human beings and God. For Masturah, knowledge and spirituality belong together. And then we come to perhaps the most important achievement of her life: the history of Ardalan. According to the source, Masturah is regarded as the first Kurdish woman historian and is described as the first woman in the Middle East to write a complete historical work of this kind. The history of Ardalan records the history of the Ardalan ruling house and the political world around it. But Masturah did not simply record names, dates, rulers, and events. She tried to understand history. She looked at political power, conflict, morality, and change. She connected events with their causes and consequences. And this is where the different sides of Masturah came together. The historian recorded events. The scholar analyzed the events. The religious thinker considered questions of morality. And the poet saw the human beings behind the politics. But eventually, history changed Masturah's own life. Her husband Khosrow Khan died in 1836, and the political world around the Ardalan Emirate changed dramatically. Masturah eventually left her beloved Sine and moved to Sulaymaniyah. For a woman whose identity and poetry were so deeply connected to her homeland, this was a painful change. She had lost her husband. The world she had known was changing, and now she was separated from the city that had shaped her life. Her longing for Sine became an important part of her later emotional world. During her years in Sulaymaniyah, Masturah became ill. In 1848, she died there and was buried in the cemetery of Tala Siwan. She was only in her early 40s, but her story did not end with her death. The political world in which she had lived disappeared. Many of the people she knew were gone. Much of her poetry was lost, but her name survived. Her history of Ardalan continued to attract attention and was later published in Russia, in Moscow, in 1990. Her surviving poetry continued to be studied, and Masturah became an important figure in Kurdish literary and intellectual history. And this is perhaps where we begin to understand why Masturah Ardalan still matters today. She was a poet and a historian. She was deeply religious and deeply literary. She could write about love and loss, but also about politics and history. She loved her husband deeply, but she did not disappear behind his identity. She loved her homeland, but she also wrote about universal human experiences: memory, faith, suffering, time, and belonging. Most importantly, she understood the power of writing as memory. Political power does not last forever. Emirates disappear, rulers die, palaces become monuments, but words can survive. Masturah lived in a world that placed many limits on women. Yet, through education, poetry, scholarship, and historical writing, she created a voice that those limits could not silence. More than a century and a half after her death, we are still talking about her. We are still discussing her poetry, her history, and the world she helped preserve. And perhaps that is the best way to remember Masturah Ardalan. She was not simply a woman who lived through history, she was a woman who made sure that history would be remembered. Thank you for listening. And if you want to continue listening to the story of Masturah Ardalan, subscribe and wait for the next episode of this story.